Do you like conversation on a variety of topics? Feel like no one wants to talk about the things that interest you? Tired of only hearing the same political, sports, or catastrophe talk? Yeah, we feel that way too. Join two high-functioning geeks as they discuss just about anything under the sun. We can't tell you what we'll be talking about each week because we don't know where our brains will take us. It will be an interesting conversation though, so hang on and join us. Here comes the Relentless Geekery.
All my memory, all right.
Yeah, I notice Chrome must have a small memory leak somewhere, because if I leave the same browser window open with multiple tabs for more than
It
a
retains
day,
something for every single window, and that stacks up. Exactly.
and even if I close it, my system goes wonky.
It's funny. I think a number of good habits that I developed over the course of time about I don't usually leave apps open. I kind of go in and out of them. I take it back. Certain ones like my calendar or a browser where I have multiple things going on, but I refresh regularly, because just with the first time you see any kind of bog down, you know what I mean? Anything taking too long or whatever, it's like, well, I actually used to have a utility that went and did memory cleanup. Memory becomes fragmented much like your hard drive used to. And so it would just do that little cleanup. And oftentimes I'd get, 3 gig back or something like that. And that seemed to be enough to zip things up. But the best way to do it, as you know, is not only to close apps, but to restart your system and have it all start off with a vast new horizon of memory allocation.
Yeah.
And
it's amazing the number of times I open multiple windows. Okay, I just looked something up. I want to remember those for later. And 3 days later, I go, why was I looking that up? I don't care about that.
Right. Probably the most memory intense things that I do, when I'm getting ready for presentations, I have my main presentation tool open, most often, sometimes PowerPoint, but most of the time Apple's Keynote. And then I have the graphics thing over here and the video thing over here and a couple of browsers and just the act of skipping around amongst them and maybe having multiple palettes open, they all seem to accumulate memory as time goes by.
Yeah.
And I end up having to be, okay, I'm halfway done with the presentation, but instead of slogging through, let's save everything, calm down, if anything, clear my head as well. Sometimes when you're working on a presentation, it's good to just go to lunch. And your mind is kind of working out in the background like we've laughed about. And then when you come back, there's better organization. There's new things you haven't thought of. There's
you got to reboot your brain too.
Yeah, exactly. And
there's so many things that run in the background now that never used to. I mean, back in the days when I booted from a floppy, you didn't have viruses, but you also didn't have consistent running apps and things.
Absolutely.
And when I check my memory and the CPU, one of the things that eats it up the most in the middle of the day, and I've tried to adjust it, is my cloud backup. I'm like, why is my cloud backup eating 47% of my memory right now?
Instead of going off at 2 a.m, instead of it being that, it's set up so that it's a memory sipper instead of a memory gobbler.
Right.
You know what I mean? We have often talked about this. I have emulation going. While I'm doing things, I'm also often testing the Windows environment, and you can actually tune that to say what's the maximum amount I'm going to allow it, or if you allow it to say for something that it knows is really a memory intensive, a critical thing, that it will take it on, but it will surrender it back when it's done.
Right.
And then sometimes it seems to lose track of that. You know what I mean? That all of a sudden my parallels, and I shouldn't say that about parallels. Parallels really seems to be really smart. It's in version 17 now. So they've had many, many, many chances to see things. And in fact, as you know, I got a new Mac with the M1 chip, which is zippy fast in so many ways, but in emulation and in certain other things, disk management, that people trail behind, because there's all kinds of new complexity to learning. Not only Apple didn't have necessarily a new file system, but how it does those things in the way that we're talking about, that it's refreshing your indices or making a backup or whatever. It needed to learn how to work with the M1's inherent memory management in order to do that, so that the old ways didn't work as well. Let's learn the new ways. Parallels took, it's August, so it took 8 months for it to get, I think I got my new back in December. It took 8 months of smart people working in every way they could with the M1 to make sure that their emulation is now to that new metal. Part of emulation is that you're in the background capturing every instruction and call, and simulating a different environment. So even different, since we had a great session on Linux and others last time, it's very fascinating to me that someone knows an operating system so deeply that they really know everything that would ordinarily go to your monitor, to your soundboard, to your every driver, every input and output. It's monitoring every port, and it's able to handle USB things and obviously your
Right.
Ethernet connection or your Wi-Fi, all without you having to worry about Wi-Fi in under Windows is slightly different than Wi-Fi under Mac. And you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by someone that has such a deep understanding that you
That
don't
that
have to worry about it.
that architecture
So
programming is like I don't even want to deal with that. That's
yeah,
way too deep for what I like to get into.
yeah. I'll tell you, we always go off. We start on something. One of the things that was a huge mind change for me was when I first started to program for GUIs. You know what I mean? Back in procedural days, I go back far enough that it was, not only COBOL and BASIC, but and let's say COBOL. It's a very procedural language. It's very you actually have good programming practices that you don't even have the go-to drop through of a BASIC program.
Oh
You
wow.
really should do it in structured blocks. So you always know what's going on, but there's never a time in your program when you're trying to debug it where you couldn't say, I got to here and something must have happened here, as compared to the world of event-driven programming, where it's got all those little demons running in the background, waiting for
Right.
you to do something that it's going to capture. And the world of memory management, error management, all that was amazingly different to think of. Well, what I used to think of as a subroutine, everything is a subroutine now, and they've all got to play really nice and really cleanly. I can't have my variables getting used up. It isn't a matter of naming conventions now or just making variable a different name. You really have to be aware of how it does its memory stack, and again, the pop on, pop off type thing,
Right.
that you don't let the programs get lost, conflict with each other, compete for resources. And when something works, it's beautiful and amazing because you're kind of like a conductor in an orchestra. Everybody out there knows exactly how to play their instrument. You don't have to know how to play every instrument,
Right.
but every instruction you send to them assumes that when I tell the oboe to do something, it's not going to act like a clarinet. It's not going to bleed over into the string section. I strain the metaphor, but
Right, right.
my
It's
first big triumph of big programs like that was, wow, there's so much more than I can keep track of in my head, even in a long 30-page program before. You could take your colored pens and trace out what was going on. And this was a whole new, like there's a pool of things that could happen. And I
right.
got to make each of those pools independently smart so that they don't bonk into each other. So it's both an expansion and a contraction, if you will. And that was they have whole computer languages that were all about that. When you went to C, when you went to C++, when you went to, like I started off with Pascal and Path Pascal, where you could do those things. I date myself, but one of the joys of being a computer coder is you have an appreciation for languages. If you're a polyglot, you have an idea of, well, every language has to have certain constructs. Everybody wants to know how to say hello,
Right,
how to,
right.
what your names are for family
Where's the
members,
bathroom?
right? Where's the bathroom? Exactly that. Please do not harm me. I am a journalist. That kind of thing. So when you learn computer languages, you can see that everybody had to come up with how they're going to do the conditional, the if then else, or the
Yeah.
repeat loop, or whatever else it might be. And then when you break through into event driven programming, there's a whole new thing of um, C and its whole idea of inheritance, and how it was not only about making the program work, it was about writing usable code that you could um, be efficient in what you're doing while still making it maintainable into the future. Well, my first C code, I used to call it like a write-only language. You know what I mean? You could so quickly get lost in the weeds of how it does inheritance, how you
Right.
um, play with, I don't know, not recursion is not the right word, though that was some of the things I used it for. You had to get an idea of, I have to keep track of where I am in cyberspace, bad word again, to know the scope of the variable that I've set and the how it's going to
Right.
create that in memory, if you will. And honestly, 90% of my early errors were nothing about I had a typo. I didn't know the language. I didn't know what parameters went with the command. It was always having to deal with I'm running into a memory leak. I'm running into an error condition that I hadn't accounted for. And so that I used to always talk about, coding is creating order out of chaos. And to get something working in the one way you thought about how it's going to go, that's 90% of the job. And then to make it so that it's bulletproof, that's the other 90%.
Right.
To make it so
Right.
you could account for what anybody might be able to do in their crazy condition at their keyboard with their mouse, just whatever things might be interruptive. It was a whole new level of accounting for everything and
Yeah.
making sure that
And
wow.
that's why when people complain and say, "Oh, Microsoft sucks," this, that, and the other thing, I'm not saying that they're perfect or great or anything like that. But what they got to realize is you installed 5 million things, all these different programs, all these things that run in memory, all these drivers. You have different hardware than the guy next to you, and all this. That's usually where the problems come in, not so much Windows, though
Exactly.
Windows has its problems. And, moving out of the old programming to the new era of programming, the hardest thing for me was the variables. Because back in the day, you'd have a variable, and that was it. It was a variable, it changed its thing. But now you could pass a variable into a function and just treat it locally in that function, but when it came back, it retained its original settings, or you could pass it back and change it. And just that power of being able to do that took me so long to wrap my head around, because I was so
Yeah.
used to it just always changes.
Yeah.
And then, like you said, writing a function or whatever. So write everything one time and then reuse it over and over. And it took a while to get used to that, because it was like, so used to step, 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 right through the program. So it
Exactly.
took a while.
Wait, it's kind of funny. Through I as I was learning how to do event-driven programming, one of the things that I really loved were there were various different vendors like MetroWorks, like Microsoft, that had foundation classes. They
Right.
had said, "Man, you don't need to write a driver for a printer every time. You don't need to write how to throw a menu up, a window up on the screen, including the right menu bar and all that stuff. We've done these things so that's how you're really going to operate. We've thought of the 300 different components that every kind of GUI program is going to make use of. And if you play by the rules, not only will they work correctly, but generationally, we will do all of the improving or deprecating as we give you the new and the old versions. And that when you have to update code, I don't know, I've written stuff that's 30 years old now that still works because I played by the rules.
Right.
And I always admired the people that were able to say, well, I could write this a little bit better, but then you would see it break spectacularly because they had played a game with memory. They had done things that were just kind of outside of, boy, Apple early on had a great book by a guy named Tognazzini, if I remember right, Bruce Tognazzini, about the mindset you need to be in design, in how you're writing a program that is user oriented, that you're always thinking of, make them comfortable, make all the options available to them. There should never be a time where they don't know what's going on. So like just that whole interesting discipline of put a progress bar up on screen, put a spinning beach ball or hourglass. Don't let them think, is it frozen? Should I do something? And then, if you're gonna like click on something because you're not sure, don't have it be that the window that hasn't popped up yet and where they would click is going to have a cancel button
Oh
where the
my
OK
God.
button used to be. And how many times, like, how could you design something like that? And yet I saw it so many
Yeah,
times that
because
people
they
got
have the window
foolish.
pop up with the main button focused on where the mouse is. And that was an old practice too. They would do that. And
Exactly.
so many times I did
Yeah.
that.
And we've laughed about this a little bit. After having gotten good at Mac programming and Fourth Dimension, a wonderful database program that also incorporated a whole bunch of programmability, that's actually what I wrote my genetic algorithm based trading systems in, because I had to have the power of that deep database, but I also had to be able to do all of my parameter driving, all that kind of stuff. When I started to do browser coding, and it was that reversion, terrible reversion back to HTML, and as if I was writing to a printer where I only have a certain number of controls, and I try. It was, wow, I can do things so elegantly if I control everything. If I'm going to write in a browser, it's not only that I want to use the classes they've created and the way it should look, what they've given me are building blocks compared to the Ferrari that I currently have. I am so primitive in what I'm trying to do now. As simple a thing as maintaining state. You know what I mean? When you go in and out of a browser, most people, some people, of course, you really want to clear everything so that there's no security concerns and stuff like that. But in other cases, if you're working on, like, I'm trying to get a reservation through an airline and I want to be able to bring back up, what was I looking at when I was last doing this? It was terrible to
Yeah.
try to just maintain. It knows who I am. It knows where I came from. I got to have some kind of unique identifier or be able to put that in so that it can go access its things on the server.
Lots of hidden fields that you store info in
And,
as you pass the
and just
pages.
that, when you learned how to do it, then it started to be like, well, this is exactly the shite that hackers are going to exploit. That I don't want to have a hidden pixel that somehow identifies me across sites. And then when you saw, honestly, when I was even first coding and saw how much I had to maintain memory and error management, and when it was difficult, it was like, this is exactly where they're going to exploit it. When I'm trying to access an SQL Server database from a place that's like that it's not built into, that doesn't have that wrapper of you can only do it a certain number of ways, it's exactly the Stack Overflow that's going to be able to have me do a code injection. And I was a pretty good guy. I did things out of curiosity to see would that happen. Yes, it indeed does. So, get on it, people who are defending against this kind of stuff. I've never been a bad guy in that way, but boy, I sure have been quickly aware of this. This is bad. They should patch this right away. I mean, and so back to pixels on screens and stuff like that. When I did a lot of work at Ameritech as a consultant, and we first started to do some of the middleware for. They have all kinds of programs running on Big Iron, but people are getting used to being able to do things from a GUI interface. So how do I make it so they can see all the parameters that you're going to like inject into JCL? Good Lord, am I dating myself? So that it runs a COBOL program properly and then returns results elegantly, where you can actually open the file through Panvalet or Librarian. Again, I'm sorry, nerds in the world, if your eyes are glazing over, even though you're really a geek, it's because we've got 40 years of geekery behind us. And so some places we're really good about, we've thought about it, and here's an interface, an API that you can use to get to these things, even though we're trying to make it, CICS early on tried to simulate interactivity, because it really wasn't that you had the computer waiting for you. You put things into a queue, and it got requests off of a queue, and then gave things to you, and it did all of its own round robin and priority management in the background, so that you could. It seemed as if you were getting near real time response.
Right.
Well, they had to simulate that with a whole bunch of the new middleware that was going to talk to older programs, and some were clean and good, and some were, nope, you're on your own. We don't maintain that anymore. And so you're going to, and like, I swear I must have written some things for Ameritech that I should have bundled that up and gone to all the rest of Big Iron in the world and said, that pesky IEB Jenner, IEB copy problem that you're having, because you're still getting tapes, physical tapes from your subsidiaries, and that's how you're having to process, but you want to control that from your GUI interface. I
Here we
did
go.
it.
Yeah, I had a couple of those.
Here's
The most fun one I remember was they wanted to start selling their products online. And this was a company that sold bolts and screws and stuff, little things.
mm-hmm.
And the system they had currently was an old VAX system that whatever was running would only allow 5 items per order at a time. Now, can you imagine companies that are going in and ordering 100 different bolts and screws? And they said, well, what we want you to do is create an interface for our machines to the VAX system so that they can have orders as big as they want and everything. And I'm like, what? Are you kidding me?
yeah. Like, that's something difficult, right?
It was weird.
Yeah. Big shout out, by the way. It's kind of funny. We like to name drop because I've known all kinds of amazing, brilliant people in my life. A guy I worked with at Pete Marwick, and then has been a lifelong friend, named Randy Meacham, is one of the first guys that I knew. Like, when I was at Pete Marwick, we used to get IEB copy tapes that there was no equivalent. We had Wang Systems instead of IBM, that the Catalyst group of Pete Marwick that did code restructuring. They didn't have all the utilities on Wang they had on IBM. So he actually wrote the equivalent of an IEB copy. IEB Jenner is very serial. IEB copy actually has an index table at the front, and it tells you where things are on the tape. And he figured out painstakingly how that index was structured, and as you might imagine, all the things like, well, it was working and then it broke. Oh, because they have some kind of on days with 28 or 31 instead of 30 days, they put in special conditions. And that isn't a good example. I don't think a real one, but all kinds of things way back when you had to worry about, was it character or data? Was it compressed data in a COBOL? You could have a pick or a pick three where it included a picture clause, or that it was a compressed field. And him being able to figure out all of what the IBM close to the metal programmers had done to store data in various different formats and then be able to read it without there really being an IB copy. So the reason I mention all that is when I was doing some of these things for Ameritech or other places, this is so much nothing. It's going to look like a miracle to the people that I'm here with. But I knew a guy that really figured out how he did the Rosetta Stone of programming.
Yeah.
He figured out an amazingly difficult problem. And
the kids nowadays don't have to deal with that stuff usually because, like you said, the APIs, the interface and all of that, it's designed to connect fairly simply.
Yeah.
I mean, I got so many programs I can choose my cloud service to store things on and bam, there it is.
Exactly. And they've made it so that you kind of can't make a mistake. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And this is another thing that coders quickly learn is to reuse things they've done before. They have kind of a library they carry around with them, or at least a library of ideas. And so when I mentioned Pete Marwick, and we had programs called Structured Retrofit and PathView. And what PathView did was tell you about how convoluted your code was. Was it good COBOL, well structured, or was it spaghetti COBOL, where those are the programs that everybody in the shop says, only Big Al knows how to maintain that. If he ever dies in a fiery bus crash, we're screwed because nobody else can figure out how convoluted this thing is. We had tools written by John Delmonico and then maintained by Jerry Hawkins, other huge brains that worked at Pete Marwick. I was so privileged to work with brilliant people early that they had figured out how to transform that spaghetti COBOL into structured COBOL.
Wow.
Reformat it, and not only reformat it like, let's make sure that it's all starting at column 7. No, it was how to actually rebuild the code so that it was all perform-based, no drop-through. It was brilliant. My small contribution to all of this was I did a lot of work at the Etna. It was my first out-of-town job. And what I just laughed about, JCL is an unnatural act. It's incredibly unforgiving if you miss a single things in the wrong column, a single column in a parameter string. It just blurts out. And the error codes it gives you are crap. You know what I mean? You have to continue.
You had a problem.
Yeah. And so what I did was I wrote a little interface in let's see, it used to be MVS. This was one step back, VM, that collected the various different things you needed to run that job. What's the exact name of your file? And you had to know if it was, as I mentioned, kind of like IBM Standard or Pavley or Librarian, so you had version control and all the parameters. And then it built the JCL for you so that it was perfect JCL, no mistakes. You didn't leave out a column. You didn't overflow without the dash in column 79 or 80 that said this is a continuing line. And the Etna was incredibly happy that they was like, well, we don't want to just use it for the structured retrofit jobs we're doing. We want this to be for every single job we got running. And so when I brought that back to Pete Marwick, another friend, H. Huseman, whose first name really is H, the letter H, which is a cool way to go through life because everybody remembers you. Yeah. I had the license plates that said like just H or H no dot. You know what I mean?
That's great.
And so they were very happy then to have that become a part of what they offered. And I don't know real numbers, but there must have been some part of when you go in and you're doing a demo to try to sell these tools. They were not inexpensive. It was the big shops that had long, thorny, spaghetti code COBOL programs that might need us. But then it wasn't just, what did they do to the COBOL code? When you sat down and did this little JCL creator type thing, can't tell you how many times, you read about this all the time, right? Where the add-on, kind of almost the throwaway feature, is actually what people are saying, oh, I want that so much. Yeah. Can you make sure that I can control with, I don't know. It was very nice that I to have made some small contributions to what was going on.
That's
I worked
cool.
on the formatter there for a while because we were vying for a big government contract, and it was impossibly hard. You know what I mean? I was there. I used to go in at like 5 o'clock and work until midnight and catch the last train out because I needed the full power of our Wang systems to be able to do multiple runs, multiple tests in the evening, and I had to wait for everybody else to go home to do that. So I made some big sacrifices early on because it was like, well, that's a thorny problem. I think I can do it. But then, when you're there late at night and you're like, it's about like 10:30 and you still got a while to go, but nobody else is there. And you're like, nobody else has to do this. Why in the world? Am I going to get a doubling of my bonus? No, I'm going to get 20% instead of 15%.
Yeah, we'll take you out to lunch.
Honestly. And so I say this all the time. I know I'm going on. Maybe I'm just excited today. I got nice
Not
raises
even your
and bonuses.
birthday.
Yeah. When I was at Arthur Anderson and then Pete Marwick, I regularly got like 20% raises and bonuses. I got quite good money. But then what made me into a consultant was you find out that you're making $25 an hour and they're billing you out at 125. And then I became a senior and they were billing me out at 250, and I had gone up from like 50 to 70 or whatever else it might be. And like, so this system is not set up to do anything but exploit me. And when I looked at my peers, the ones that hadn't made the sacrifice of being out of town for a year, that hadn't made the sacrifice of staying up all night, they were still, as I said, getting 15% instead of 20. And like when I looked at how many extra hours I had put in compared to what I had gotten paid for those extra hours, I was making like French fry wages.
Right.
I was the guy at McDonald's listening for the beep. And I like, man, if I'm going to do this for a living, I really need to like take on more risk in order to get more reward. And so, it's kind of name dropping day. Carol Lake, a consultant at Pete Marwick, she was the first one that kind of said, I'm going to do that. I'm going to take on more risk and get more reward. And I don't even know that she was like the superstar there, but she had grit. She was the one that was willing to say, let's roll the dice. And so I was like, wow, if Carol can do it, I can do it. I should follow that smart, brave example. And then after that, it was, I made much better money than what they were paying me at Pete Marwick by doing work at Ameritech, at Quaker Oats, at Chicago Board of Trade, and all that kind of stuff. This is kind of funny. Here, I guess this is Al's resume episode. Sorry, but I don't know. I was very happy that when I worked at Ameritech as a consultant, every year I gave myself a little raise when it came down to time to renegotiate the contract, kind of year by year. And I wasn't totally independent. I worked for a company that was kind of my finder, if you will, and yet they didn't have to do much work. I kept getting approved at Ameritech. I was renewed at Ameritech like 13 years in a row. So when I looked at giving myself a little bit of a raise, Ameritech never objected. I gave them like, half of the new little raise, but I kept making the bigger share of it. And so roundabout, the reason that I have so many comics and so many albums and so many CDs is because even though I was working tons of hours, I was making pretty good money early on, enough that I had, like, by being out of town for Pete Marwick, people talk about this. They went and they worked in inhospitable conditions in Texas when there was a big strike, and the management had to do all of the running of the refineries and stuff like that. But in a year, they made huge triple time bonusy type money, and that kind of sets you up for life. If you can get out of rent and into a house early, if you can buy a car for cash instead of having to take out a loan. And I had some similar experiences to that. I worked hard, but boy, my rewards were nice, and I didn't have to worry as much about that trade-off anymore. You know what I mean? Whenever I was, hey, this concert's pretty expensive. Well, if I'm making like $100 an hour and the ticket costs $100,
go work an hour.
I can do that pretty easily, actually. Why am I fooling myself? Because I still had staunch Midwestern values growing up where you're just parsimonious. You know what I mean?
I just had that conversation with somebody over the weekend, because that way of thinking my father doesn't get. As far as my father is concerned, I haven't worked in over 20 years, that I just sit upstairs playing on my computer all day.
Wow.
He even
doesn't have the gig mentality, doesn't have
not at all. He even told the neighbor, he's like, yeah, his wife goes out to work every day and he just sits in the house. And I've been doing this for over 20 years. And I'm consulting, working for myself, billing out, getting money. Yes. And we went to the neighbor's kid's birthday party when my kids were little. And he goes, hey, you need to go talk to Rosie's husband. I'm like, oh, really? Why? Well, he runs this computer store down in Canada. I'm like, oh, that's cool. He's like, yeah, maybe he'll give you a job. I don't want to go work at a computer store for like a third of what I'm making right now.
Exactly.
Jumping back though on something you said earlier about the reusing and all that, one of the things I've been playing around with is Python, which I've mentioned,
Yes.
but I would love to write something that a good app, a good game or something that runs on mobile, on phones, on tablets, things like that. It's very difficult to write across board without tons of tools,
Okay.
especially Apple. They don't make it easy on you. They've gotten better.
Okay.
But one of the things I found for Python was called Kivy, Kivy,
I don't
and
know it.
it's a framework essentially that allows you to write in Python and write your code, and then you basically click a button and it exports it into the format needed for Android and iOS, and you can go through the stores and upload it and all that.
Write
The
once, multi-platform instead of different versions
Yeah,
that will go out of sync depending on what they're
right.
doing with each of their OS. Okay.
And
Yes.
there's not a lot
Ivy.
of things that do that. Most of the time, you're two separate IDEs or something writing separate and trying to keep your code in line.
Right.
Um, One of the things though about Kivy is that when you write buttons or windows and stuff, it doesn't use the system default. It has its own. So the downside is even on Apple products, it won't look like an Apple product. It'll look different. And
Right.
I'm not sure why they do that, if it's just because it's too difficult to do it across the board. But so it's that balance, because I can definitely know that people, I pick up my Apple phone, I know how to use every app. They all look alike and they're comfortable with that. So you throw something at them that's not, and they could look at, and maybe they don't even use it. So you could have the best program in the world, and just because your buttons don't look the same, people will
Right.
dismiss it. So that, there's a trade-off there.
I hear you, boy, and I've experienced exactly those kinds of things. You know what I mean? That once you get used to the um, overall elegance and look alikeness of Apple, that when you drop into Windows or do anything there was probably 20 years when things were still being written for Apple that weren't using Apple's foundation classes.
Right.
And um, nowadays, boy, I'll tell you, their tools are great in terms of Swift, and it supports multiple languages, and it really, again, back to one of the things you learned early at Pete Marwick about how to write good code, and especially how you use structured code, was you had to isolate the I/O. That if you're depending on what monitor you were talking to, whatever database, IMS, IDMS, etc., you had to be able to isolate that, because that's where you um, when you're doing your testing, you need to know that it was exactly this area and that you could pump a bunch of data through it and not worry about it was buried in the code, but that it was right here where you could look at it and analyze it. Well, that's a very important thing. We're doing anything multi-platform nowadays, that you really need to know um, how it talks to the outside world, not just within its own internal interface. And that's been very helpful. And um, as we've gone through multiple versions of, it handles a serial port different than a parallel port, and then it handles a Wi-Fi different than a fixed connection, and all of those things for the new paradigm of, well, it's not always on, but you need to be able to return to where it was just before. So how do you maintain a constant, near constant connection, even if that's not really what's happening? So this is just, I love geeking it up like this. There's a stack, right? There's a 7-level stack of
Right.
how you do those kinds of things, and um, each system recommends how to do it so that it's always a trade-off between throughput or constant access, if you will. You know what I mean? That you need to be able to break a connection. You can't assume that you've been able to maintain it. And even if you want to, it can't, there's times when a tower will drop your signal while you're driving or whatever else it might be. And so, especially when they started to deal with any kind of media like music, where any break, any glitch, you immediately notice it. You know what I mean? You might get drop out on the phone and just say, well, that's because the phone's crackly, but a song stuttering in the middle of
Right.
it, a movie stuttering. So they got so smart early on about codecs, about things that compress and decompress, and how to do bursty stuff, that it does a whole bunch of processing so that it maintains the stream of what's coming to the
Right.
screen. But in the background, it's doing a whole different thing for how it's attaching and getting the next and queuing and decompressing and all that kind of stuff. And one of the cool things was all kinds of stuff that I learned about compression and decompression applied very much to encryption and decryption. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? The transformations that you're doing of data. So another one of those reuse things of, like, I am so comfortable in this world of, like, prime number seeking, fractal ish, bursty type all those transmission and decoding and all the kind of stuff, it had incredible applicability across multiple things that I've worked on over the course of my life. And I think that most people's brains identify that, this is you find similarities and differences, the whole compare and contrast in your essay between this and this and this, and so many things that I thought when I was young, well, this is just an exercise. But you find out how important outlining is, how important compare and contrast is, how close is it. Like when you're looking at doing things in C, there's a choice you make between, is it worth writing another class, or is it worth taking an existing class and inheriting, but also changing some things about it.
Right.
And you get that feel for, well, what's more elegant, what's more maintainable, what's more understandable. And if you want to write code that you don't have to have to comment on it throughout to just explain what you're trying to do and not explain to somebody else, when you come back in 6 months, if you stare at your own code and you're like, what the hell?
Yeah. How did I do that? Why did I do that?
Why did I do
Who
that?
wrote that? Oh, I did. Oh, really?
Yep.
When did I do that? Was I awake?
Yeah. I loved when coding outfits started to really be about that it wasn't just about what's the fastest version we can give to the user. It was also that whole idea of maintainability, and there's a famous quote of, if woodpeckers, if we built buildings like coders built code, one woodpecker would bring down civilization. You learn how to write good, maintainable, the variable names make sense. You comment where you need to, but not over comment, because that seems, this is a print routine. Yeah, I could tell right away through the use of this command that it's a print routine. Oh, well, inheriting code, when I used to go into places and had to fix problems that things had broken, you get, it's kind of, you can tell a writing style. I think I might be able to pick out your writings after having read a couple of your short stories and books. You can tell a Poe from a Lamour, from a Hemingway or something like that. Well, you get that idea about coding styles too. You know what I mean? How they write, how they code, what constructs they choose to use when there's a choice. Some people love case statements, and some people have a sequence of embedded if-then-else's.
Oh, geez.
And I know I'm geeking out, but you know what I mean? It's really cool to be able to say, wow, I knew this guy, and this is his code from a previous job that now we're having to work on.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know this code.
Yeah, and exactly.
I know this code. You work on it.
Right.
And speaking
there's got to
of
be code out there that I'm embarrassed about. I know there's got to be stuff that I wrote that's
there's code I work on now that I'm like, I know I was just in a hurry when I did that. Let me fix
the
this.
quick and dirty versus the perfectly maintainable. Exactly.
Well, another thing I've been doing, because I mentioned Linux Mint, I'm finding that 80-ish% of what I do, I can do on this Linux Mint. Because like we talked about, most of what I do is, through browsers or whatever, and I can use a different editor. Yeah. I mean, I can't use Word on it, but I have a word processor. So I consider that doing the same thing, So one of the things I'm playing around with is a game maker framework to make a game. I've got several on Windows. Honestly, it's easier on Windows, but I'm just seeing what I can do and being able to say, hey, I did all of this on Linux Mint. I used open source software, one of those geek things.
Okay.
But the program I'm really starting to like because of the way they build it. It's very programmer logic, but easy GUI UI. And I'm like, this is cool because I get how it's working and how I think. Mm-hmm. And I actually am starting to like it a little better than a similar one I have on Windows. So that's, always cool to look at something new and try.
Exactly. And if anything, I hardly ever, I don't mean to, sometimes I want to learn a tool so well that it's second nature. It just kind of flows out of your fingertips and stuff like that. But then something comes along that has many improvements, and there's that little bit of angst of, am I really going to make the change? I feel really comfortable over here, but boy, this stuff. And then when I changed to Swift, when I got out of other programming languages and went to Swift, it was, there really are so many benefits to this, and it matches my mindset. It matches the mindset of the right GUI and the right depth and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know, I have the ability to go back to other things, but usually what they're accompanied by is, that's the old bad way of doing things. And I, in the course of my career, as you might imagine, I was really good at seeing a parade and getting in the front of it. You know what I mean? You know what new developments are coming, and I'd rather learn the new and be one of the early adopters and an early expert in it, because that way, when people are choosing to adopt, there's an enthusiasm and there's good rates and stuff like that for being able to do that. But because I had all these older skills, I was often dragged into, well, we really need to maintain mainframe stuff here as well. Can you work on that as well? And it was, wow, it isn't so like, then you're going to pay the scarcity penalty and the discomfort penalty. You know what I mean? It isn't the standard rates, because I know that there aren't that many people that are doing Watt 4, Watt 5 anymore for their report generator. And the fact that I can still do it, there's no joy in it. There's no, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I had a number of things that I took on that really were, you give a rate that to scare them off because you really don't want to do
They
the
say,
work.
yes, we're that
And then
desperate.
they still say yes. And it's like, well, I guess I'm in for a quarter then. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I learned to be very defensive. It's like, I'm not doing this for a year. I'm going to do a quarter, and we'll see if you like what I'm doing. But really what I'm saying is, I'll see if I like what I'm doing, and I want to continue in this. And there's very few things that I've walked away from, you know what I mean, that got nothing. I take it back, not only a matter of difficulty, but a matter of atmosphere. Have I told you this story? You know, I did some work for Foot Cone and Belding, a big advertising company. And it was trying to put together a content management system. And I had this thing where they'd give me some specs, and I'd go back and I'd put together a rudimentary one and say, so what do you think? You know, tell me, give me, this is my first brush at it. Tell me what you like. And my analogy is always, well, so I had this kind of nice Christmas tree. And instead of saying, well, we prefer tinsel to garlands and we prefer different colored lights, they would say, oh, we wanted a pine instead of a fir. They would just gut the thing.
Yeah.
And so I did more than once, 3 times. I came back with kind of a new paradigmic thing, and they would tear it up again. And I kept code from previous times so that sometimes what they reviled, now they liked again. But I was getting just so frustrated over, I'm not making any headway. And the way that this place works in my mind was kind of like Mad Men. They're in a room and they're throwing ideas, and they're you know, it's all unstructured until, because of time, because we have to get something to ship, because the presentation is tomorrow morning, so we're going to decide at midnight. And you can't work like that and stay sane. You have to get a spec, and you have to make code that meets the spec. And then if that's going to be maintained, you have to say, well, changes will cost you because it wasn't in the original spec. And I didn't want to be negotiating every single time that I went in with, you didn't talk about this before. Well, can you just fit it in? I no, not in the frame that we've given me. And if you do, you're going to have to pay. What's the small change? That your mercurial way that you do your brainstorming is very different than what you have to do to ground yourself in reality while you're coding. And honestly, that's the one that I was like giving myself ulcers. And I actually, the third time this happened, I kind of said, I am not your man. I really can't work like this. And it wasn't being, I don't think, prima donna. It wasn't, you know, I wasn't a diva about anything. It was, I had never, sometimes when you come in and you're the expert, people are respectful to you. I don't need anybody kowtowing, but I just want them to be that I'm an equal partner in it. And I kept feeling that I was just this punk coming in, and they're gonna, like, they'll humor me with giving me specs, but they'll keep some things to themselves. You know what I mean? I have real emotion about this because it was uncomfortable to the end.
Yeah, it's not that you can't do that. One of my favorite stories, I had created a browser-based web app for this company, and at last minute, the one owner boss goes, well, I want a button that does this, blah, whatever it was, I don't remember. I said, well, okay, let me go look at that. It's going to take about this much time and stuff. Let me work up a quote to add this new feature on. She's like, well, what do you mean? It should be easy. Okay, you're not the programmer. Trust me, this isn't like the most simple thing. She literally pulls up Word and goes, well, look, I just want that same button put here. That's all you got to do.
Right.
That's not how it works.
How many times have you and I read Dilbert and said, was he looking over my shoulder? Was he, just that? You know what I mean? Every time, to develop a worldwide server infrastructure, it's like, that'll take about 2 minutes. You know
Yeah, Dilbert. Yeah, I just picked this one up. I still read Dilbert. I'm not as much in the corporate world, but I read it and I chuckle because I'm like, oh yeah, I remember those
That's right.
days.
A dozen things in there have happened painfully close for me.
Oh,
And so,
it's crazy.
honestly, when I used to do spec meetings, I did any kind of things. I just talked about this with Colleen the other day about doing spec meetings, and you're getting people to talk about what their current systems do and what they want to do in the new version, and you're papering the walls. Back then, it was not project from a laptop up, and and it was just at the cusp, if I remember correctly, where we started to be like, so no matter what we're doing, we're not doing Dilbert, right? Please don't withhold information. Don't assume that every job that you don't understand is an easy job, because it's not. And so I had a lot of fun doing that, and that's one of the reasons I was there for 13 years, because I was pretty successful at it. But there were any number of times, to go into it briefly, Ameritech was a 5-state region, and they used to have there were different sizes of business, and so as you might imagine, Illinois, then Michigan, then Ohio, I think that was the order. They had the biggest call as to what has to be in the features, because they had to have something that would work with what they currently have from being a baby bell. Wisconsin and Indiana had very specific features based on their public utilities commission or whatever else it might be. So they had to continually advocate for, we need all those features, but we can't leave this out because it would be illegal. And the trade-offs that we continually had to make for, well, so we decided this is the feature set, and then can't tell you how many times it would be, wow, so we took weeks to talk through everything, and we reviewed it here on the board, we reviewed it on paper, and now we're going to finalize this. And someone would pipe up with, well, what about this? It's like, I need your full attention while you're here. You really need to dedicate yourself to, you can't make these other people in the room waste their time and another week lost because we have to go rewrite the spec. It has to be that we are bearing down and not leaving anything out. Or, you know what that is? That's version 2. It doesn't matter if it's legal. That's going to be in version 2 of this product.
If
we have to get
here's our spec. If you want it by this date, this is all we can do. And,
exactly.
And don't wait until a week before and say this needs change. It's not going to happen. That's not how it's just not how it works.
Yeah. And luckily, I was blessed by those 2 small states, Wisconsin and Indiana. I had one guy that got on my side with, I didn't have to be the bad guy. He was the one that would say, practically what we have to do is this. Sorry, Indiana, that might have been our problem child. I don't mean to defame the whole state of Indiana. Right. But why not? But anyway, but you know what I mean?
We got to pass through there to get to Chicago, so be careful.
Yeah. And in fact, I'm loving this name dropping day. The gentleman's name from Wisconsin was Joel Narlock. Really brilliant, a blast to be around. One of those guys that it isn't just that you're working on this stuff together. You had a nice time doing it. You had a good sense of humor and stuff. He wrote an early book, the earliest that I can think of seeing in print, about drones, about using, semi-autonomous things in warfare, in criminal activity, if you will. And it was fascinating and really well done. I wish that the name was popping out. Might have been something kind of generic, like executive action or something like that. But I was like, go, write this book and then start a whole series. And you are the futurist that I really like from any number of people, where it's not science fiction future going to other planets. It's taking what we currently have and just that next extrapolation of, well, when we really do have genetic manipulation, what are the ups and downs of that? What are the goods and bads? And just put it 10 years in the future so that it really is like scary in a way of, we could go either path here. Why don't we choose the good one? Because he's got some pretty telling examples of how it could go, good or bad. So hats off to Joel Narlock for having the visionary idea of, what are we going to do when we have these things that are kind of untraceable? You can send in swarms. You can have, if they're really autonomous, then all of a sudden you've got something that can kill that doesn't have an overriding authority. And he limbed out the issues that we're still contending with today, and that must have been like in the mid 90s. Wow. You know what I mean? He was brilliant. So nice. Well done, Joel.
We'll look that up. All right, so let's shift gear for a second.
Okay.
Because we made a whole list, and it's like, well, that's out of the window. Who cares? Why bother thinking ahead of time? We don't follow it, but it gives us something to look forward to maybe next week.
Okay. So
But but
what did you want to talk to? I know that you had a couple things that
oh,
were
well, first of all, let's go give some updates on a few things because we've
okay.
added a couple things to the website.
Okay.
We have a top 10 list page, which we've only got one top 10 list at the moment. So we need to jump on that and get our second one. So think of something good for our second one
Okay.
sometime. But we also put on there uh, a, a little bio about each of us and some of our talks, some of the get up in front of people, public speaking
And
stuff.
I haven't given you full information for here's what is in that talk. I'm
Still
sorry about
working
that.
on that.
Exactly.
But do you have any actual talks scheduled coming up? Now that maybe things are changed a little bit.
Actually, yes. For Baldwin Wallace University here in Cleveland, which is a nice big concern, I'm actually teaching for their adult learning section, a 6-session course starting in September and going into October about comic books. And
Nice.
I've been able to, I have, as you know, a number of comic book talks that I've given. So I've been able to like repurpose some of those things and update them. So it's a history of comics in general. It's a history of comic book movies. It's a diversity in comic books, female archetypes, um, uh, famous, not famous, mythical places, if you will. And and I think it's kind of funny. I can never remember the sixth one, but I'm pretty sure that it's like, oh, that's the one I said I was still going to work on. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. But that'll be, it's, my little bone of contention, perhaps poor phrase, is I'm scheduled to speak live. It's good. They have multiple facilities at the university and various different places. And right now, when they ask me what would I like to do, Zoom or remote learning, if you will, or regular, it's like, well, I think I get more energy and give off more energy out interacting. I really like that.
Yep.
So let's go with that. And then COVID, Delta variant, resurgence, Ohio not good, all of those things. And I'm like, well, if it's supposed to start in September, we need to start making some decisions perhaps now so they can publicize. It's not going to be in conference room A. It's actually going to be back to Zoom, and let's set all that up if we need to. Um, I'm looking forward to doing it. And in fact,
That's cool.
I have to talk to Kent State. You know, it's now August. Their spring semester starts. That's kind of up in the air as to whether they're doing 2 days on, 3 days off, hybrid, remote, whatever
Right.
it's going to be. But that's a standing talk that I have with them for what's the latest and greatest comic book topic that they'd like me to speak. That'll be like my fourth time speaking with them.
Nice.
And
Nice.
it's nice. And what I've been working on with them, without going into it too much, is I've done these talks and they kind of make it one entry in a catalog, if you will. Well, what I'd like it to be is some of the things I talk about, they're not only of like, hey, maybe it'll be interesting to the kids. It's like, well, this actually has some interest to sociology. The first way I got in there was a multidiscipline group that talked about history, sociology, political science, that kind of stuff. And that's where I first did things about diversity and expanded on the diversity thing. That it wasn't only about multiple races of humanity. It was, well, what about intelligent animals or AI and how about alien life forms? And so the comic book world allows you to expand into that. But it's also that it's always had, well, that's pretty much talking about what we're doing here or not. Are they treated as whole human beings or not? Having said that, I don't have that scheduled, but I'm going to be working on seeing if that can get scheduled. And then all my little returns to the various different libraries that I had spoken of that all pulled back on me, they're
Yeah.
still skittish. The ones I have talked to, Bay Village and stuff like that, they're still, we're not doing talks because we can't, especially for kids, got to be especially
Yeah.
careful. They can't be vaccinated yet. They're just still working on how good and safe that is.
Right.
And I sure don't want to be typhoid Al. I'll keep my mask on and everything, but I don't want to be, hey, they went to a talk and everybody got sick.
Yeah.
I couldn't live.
There goes your talks.
Yeah. And I couldn't care less about my talks. I would hate to be that
Right.
the atmosphere that we created, little Billy came in. He was, without knowing it, a carrier. And all the Billies and Susies besides him got hurt. And oh boy.
Right.
Oh
Yeah.
boy.
It's so tough because I've been trying to work up a couple talks.
Mhm.
And the one I am doing one at the Western Pennsylvania RG coming up.
Very
I'm doing
good.
the
Okay.
Supercharger Kids talking with parents on the future of our work. I walked into the one Walmart the other day and there was one cash register with a lady. The rest were self checkouts. So I mean, any of these
Interesting.
kids that are 9, 10 that might want to, be a bag boy or something in a couple of years, they don't
Even that's
exist.
going away.
Yeah, you can't
Exactly.
do it. So, that's kind of the focus. And so I'm working on a couple others. it's just, where to do the talks right now,
Yeah.
so
We're not going to be going to WPAM because usually that's Labor Day weekend and the family has a picnic and stuff. I didn't go. VML was just this last weekend, and so many of my good friends were there. But Colleen and I are being cautious about the resurgence, about and I want to go visit my parents. I don't want to do anything that's going to queer the deal about I'm pure as the driven snow in order to be able to do that. I'm ready for the booster shot, et cetera, et cetera. But Columbus is having one in the middle of October. Chicago's big one, 500, 600 people coming at the end of October. And we're having a meeting. The committee meeting is this Thursday night to talk about, are we going to be able to do this? We have to be aware of if Illinois or the city of Chicago or the hotel all say, no, restricted to 25 people in a room, that pretty much aces out a 500 person event. Pretentious drinking that I host, which usually has 200 of those 500. You can't really have, sipping of liqueurs without lifting your mask. You can't do it with a sippy cup. Exactly. So we're going to talk about those things. Very real world, in or out. A band that I wanted to go see in Chicago at the end of this month, the Residents, canceled their tour because of this going on. And especially they have one of the guys is in the Netherlands, and he can't get into the United States without quarantine and guarantee that he can go everywhere that he wants, because whatever those international agreements are for what places are safe, the relative numbers and so forth, he can't do it.
Wow.
And so that, I'm glad that you're able. WPAM should be fun. I'm hoping that we'll be able to return to speaking. Colleen and I have this conversation pretty often about, wow, I really like live speaking. I really like the interaction with people, the laughter in the room, not the kind of chittery laughter of a Zoom session. And it's just very different. I am much more energized and heartened by a whole room full of smiling people instead of a little Brady's Bunch gallery of smiling faces. It just doesn't do the same thing for me.
Absolutely.
So I'll do it if that's what's necessary, but my stuff is not necessary. You know what I mean? I'm not teaching here's the real world practical skills of how to invest.
It's not brain surgery or rocket science.
It's not rocket surgery. Exactly.
Rocket surgery. Right. So I want to ask, and I have a reason for jumping on this topic because we have a couple we listed.
Yes.
You just talked about a movie that was horrible that you saw called Almost Heroes.
Heroes.
So what's up with that? And I got a reason for asking this, so I'll delve into that in a minute.
So a little bit of a preface. Colleen and I have a wonderful thing where we really we don't just watch randomly. We have we watched all the AFI top 100 movies. We have certain directors we really want to, you said, I want to see every Hitchcock movie. He did so many great movies, and we kind of want to see him in order so that we can see his growth as an artist. And I don't say that tongue in cheek. It really is that you see amazing things happening in the course of movie history by following Hitchcock or somebody like that.
Right.
So I really like Christopher Guest. He's done a number of semi-improv movies like Best in Show and For Your Consideration that are just hilarious, tongue-in-cheek, really well done. Started with Spinal Tap, even though he didn't write that. That was the first of that genre, if you will. And so having said that, I am a completist. We rented Almost Heroes, which is he's the director, but not the writer, and not even seemingly a prime contributor, because it's Matthew Perry and Chris Farley and a bunch of other character actors you've seen before. But it was unbelievably bad. The fact that Christopher Guest was directing it, I can't believe that he got to the end of a scene and said, "That's good, on we go."
I didn't know he directed it.
Fix this. We got to put it's a joke. Make it funny. We got to get some laughter that isn't puerile 14-year-old poo-poo humor. How about so many of other things have been so witty and so knowing and just subtle, and there's nothing less subtle than Chris Farley falling down again. You know what I mean?
Right.
He can be very funny, but this was his last movie from what I understand.
Right, it was.
And I don't know. He, maybe the director, didn't have enough control over him to say, I'm going to need you to do that just a little less broad, just a little less ridiculous. Don't immediately launch into apoplexy every time that you're on camera. It was just unbearably bad. And what a surprise. After you've seen, you're like, I guess everybody has that, right? They did one movie just for the money. They did it as summer stock where they had to be working, and somebody brought him in as a favor. And you know what I mean? Eugene Levy is in the movie, kind of that part of the Second City TV connection. And it's the worst role I've ever seen him in.
Wow.
And
I heard it wasn't a
Colleen
good
actually,
movie.
yeah, it one of those things like, Rotten Tomatoes gave it 8 out of 100. It really, and there's all kinds of reviews that echo a lot of what I just said. It was like, I kept waiting for anything to be
For
funny.
something.
90 minutes lost of my, and Colleen left early. I actually stuck around to see it to the
Wow.
bitter, bitter end. You know what I mean? Maybe they're saving all the laughs for a big climax at the end. No,
Nope.
it frittered
Wow.
away my time.
Well, it's funny because I just rewatched Casino Royale with David or Daniel Craig
Daniel Craig, exactly.
because the new one's coming. So it's like, oh, I'm going to watch all
Yeah.
his, not all the James Bond. I have seen
Okay.
most of them, but just his. Anyway, but I'm watching it and I started making, I guess, click a little bit between story and the filming and what the director and actors do. Because you could very easily say, you know, this guy had something and he went into the airport. And in the story, you could tell it simply as James Bond followed him and they fought and he captured the briefcase. That's
Okay.
one line. But in the movie with the director, it's like 10, 15 minutes and there's a chase and there's a fight. And, and I'm like, okay, I see that with this, over the top action movie
Right.
that the story is James Bond chased him, they fought, and he took the briefcase. But the movie is completely different. And it could be done in like 30 seconds. And James Bond just walks up, shoots him, takes the briefcase, and that's boring. So
Right.
anyway, I started making that connection watching that. And
Yeah. In order to heighten your involvement, it's like you really got to care about that briefcase. And that's because it took a ton to get that
yes,
briefcase
yeah.
instead of it being, I found it next to a guy I shot or
Right.
something like that.
And it really shows the power that the director and the actors have to make
Yes.
it come to life and make it their own. We always joke about, oh, look, Tom Cruise is in a Tom Cruise movie because
Exactly.
he's the same freaking character every single movie.
As Colleen says, you mean that cocky young guy, the one where he plays the cocky young guy? Yeah, I've seen those
Right.
movies.
Yes.
Yeah, every one of them.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But you also know what to expect when you go see it.
Right.
That if you like that type of character, he typically chooses a role where that character fits. So
Right.
you know what you're getting. In some ways, that's
hats off. He does choose good people to work with. Every one of
Yeah.
the Mission Impossible movies, I've been like, these are great.
I love those.
You know what I mean? There's real stakes, and he does his own stunts. And so when you see him on top of a 100-story tall building, it's like, Tom, man, you got balls of platinum.
Yeah.
Man, you are.
The one where he's hanging on the outside of the airplane and they showed
Like
the behind
that.
the scenes. And it's
Exactly.
like, 17 times going up in the air, hanging on the side. Of course, he's got equipment. I
Right.
wouldn't expect anything less.
And
I wouldn't even
nonetheless-
do it with the damn equipment.
That's
Screw that.
So I know that serves his adrenaline need, and yet what an amazing thing that he has. That he has the ability to do that. He's got the ability to focus, and he's got the body strength, and you know what I mean. He's got
Yeah.
the coordination and all. That's very cool.
I mean, for his age, he's in incredible shape.
Absolutely.
I mean, you see him running in the movies, and they show one of those scenes where the thing's going down the track and following him. I'm like,
Right.
okay, I would have fallen over out of breath by this point. And he's older than I am. So, kudos, man. And that's probably not the first take. I mean, he's probably ran
That's
that
true.
track.
Let's go again, but I'm going to do a little more steeplechase thing here over the track. You know what I mean?
But yeah, you're right. Those are really good movies. I mean, I can't really say one's a dud at all because they're
Right.
all slightly different and stuff.
Yeah.
Lots of good action, and I'm a sucker for good action movies. So
I'll tell you, we could, when we're talking about a top 10 list, we love doing the undiscovered things. Like I have a
Yes.
whole bunch of movies that unless I tell you about them, you might not see them, but I have loved them. And we also have a whole bunch of movies that you need to warn your friends away from. Kevin once told me about Hobo with a Chainsaw, a Rutger Hauer vehicle.
Wow.
And I'm like, well, Rutger Hauer, I like him. It was his last movie, I think, and it was just what you would expect. Like, I guess he needed to make sure his family was taken care of. You know what I mean? It was so bad, and yet, as opposed to being only pissed, I was kind of like laughing after a while, and we're like, sure, let's go there. Let's do that thing next. Yeah,
because
let's do this violence
the hobo
times 10.
he can't afford socks, but damn it, he has a chainsaw.
Like that, exactly.
Hey, how about some change?
Once in a while, I want to watch a movie that Colleen steps into the room and a minute on the screen, she's like, you do that, honey. I'm going to go do something much more sensible than guns and explosions and chainsaws and hobos.
That sounds like the best. Well, that's funny you say the worst movies because this is why I was bringing this up. I'm doing self promotion here.
Okay.
My buddy Rhys, who I have known since like third or fourth grade,
All right.
and we've known forever. I told you a little bit about him. He has been watching horror movies and keeping track of them and rating them and giving him a little synopsis.
Right. So he's got the encyclopedia of horror being built. That's
See,
really cool.
I told him, I said, dude, you need to write a book. You need to start going to colleges and stuff. And he's like, I'm not an expert. Yes, you are the expert. I don't know if there's anybody in the world that has watched 1,200 horror movies except you. That makes you the expert de facto. Just
exactly.
end the story. And he keeps nah, I don't want to do that. And I'm like, okay. So I said, hey, how about this? How about if we do a podcast where we do it like in seasons and take a theme and watch 10 movies with that theme, but movies that most people haven't heard of. I said my criteria is no real big name actors, no real big Hollywood budget, not the biggest ones, so not The Conjuring, not Friday the 13th or any of those.
Like you said, yeah.
And so he's like, well, I think I can come up with some. So he's got 3 seasons worth of lists, and we've been working our way through season 1.
All right.
And there's only 1 or 2 of the movies out of the 10 that I had even heard of before we did this. So we're watching these and we're reviewing them and doing an analysis of the movie. So it's called Horror Lasagna. And isn't that great?
It's funny. I was going to throw out, you might want to call it Terror Cognita, a variation on Terra Incognita.
Right.
And if you liked it, then send me a pizza. You know what I mean?
Right there, yes.
Lasagna. Very cool. Okay.
Because we were just chatting, we said, okay, let's do a little intro that we could put up before the season and just tell people a little bit about us and why we want to do this, etc. Yeah. And we were just chatting like you and I do. And I said something. He goes, yeah, it's kind of like a horror lasagna. That's the name. That's it right there. Yep. It just got thrown out. And so I'll put a link in, but we've been having a lot of fun with that.
Very cool.
And he's like, well, do you think we'll do a fourth season? Because I've got 10 more. I got this scene. So the first season's theme is movies about buddies or friends. And it's all these horror movies. But I guarantee you probably haven't heard of or seen most of these movies ever. And I don't even know what all the ratings are because you have to appreciate them in a way other than how you evaluate a popcorn thriller, in the summer.
Absolutely.
They're different. And we started off really dark. And I'm like, we probably shouldn't have done so dark for the early episodes. But the end of the season's ending up more lighthearted and humorous. But a few good movies.
I'll tell you, that's a great theme. I mean, I know that horror movies are a perennial good seller. There's a reason that they keep getting made, and that you can often make them for less expensive. You don't necessarily have to have big special effects. You need to have makeup effects in some ways, and that's so much less than a battle cruiser in space. You know what I mean? So and it just is whatever it speaks to humanity of the more that we get kind of wonder bred in our life, that everything is normal and the same and so forth, people have the desire for love or terror or, you know what I mean, extraordinary emotions because things kind of level out after a while in your life.
Right.
How interesting. And the fact that you've got this guy that knows so much.
Oh yeah.
We love doing this. You know what I mean? Here's the things that unless we include you, when if we have Halloween, I intend to do a talk about progressive rock, and I don't want to just say the same albums that everybody's heard of. It's well, there's modern stuff going on, and this is an obscure one, but you really should get Intergalactic Touring Band. And that's one of my joys of turning a friend onto something that they wouldn't have stumbled onto on their own. But boy, it's worth it. It's really worth seeking this out.
Right.
So
it's funny you mentioned budget too, because 2 of the movies on our list cost $6,000 to make. That's it.
Held cameras or whatever they have nowadays. It does steady cam, but it's all inexpensive nowadays.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
And they were actually really good in different ways. And we talk about the themes of the movies and what we picked out of it, the symbolism, because we have a friend that's huge on symbolism. So it's always a big thing to talk about sitting around. And, we even say good movies, bad movies, complete spoilers, because we're talking about the movie from beginning to end.
Exactly.
And man, just the very first movie is probably the most disturbing movie I have ever seen in my life.
Wow. So
That
he started off with a bang.
Oh
Oh
man,
my.
and I would not even mention this movie or recommend it to 99.9% of the people I know at all. That
Right.
no, there's very few people that would understand and appreciate watching it. I guarantee
Right.
Colleen would hate it. Absolutely. You
Right.
might
The
not
one
like
that
it.
gets the churches picketing saying this movie shouldn't even exist. We
Oh,
should
exactly.
be allowing this to be out there.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and we even said that. We're like, it's amazing that this exists. And but the thing was, he's like, does it make me a bad person when I can understand and almost sympathize with the force that's creating this? I'm like, I know. I thought the same thing. I'm like, what is wrong with me? But then we said that's how well done the movie is, that the director did this, that it makes you question some of your own beliefs and values in a very significant way, to the
That's
point where it's like, why don't we take a break for a couple of days before we do another one? Because I really need to clear my head. It is
right.
really that disturbing.
Disturbing.
Oh,
Exactly.
very. But
Okay.
then the last movie I watched was called Suck, and it's a vampire rock and roll movie.
Okay.
And Iggy Pop is in it, and Alice Cooper, and Alex Lifeson from Rush is in it.
How
Uh,
interesting is
and
that? Okay.
yeah, and it's very, they do claymation, but it looks like some eighth grader did it for a project at school. I mean, but it's purposefully done bad. And I loved every minute of it. Just had a
Very
really
good.
good time with it.
Yeah.
So, it's just across the board. Been very fun. So I'll put a link in. I'll tell you about some of the movies you should. Some of them I guarantee you've never heard of.
Very
Some
good.
probably aren't worth seeing for most people, but
Yeah. It's funny.
overall,
I'm curious, but I know I've said this before. I really don't want to have images put into my head that I can't get rid of in some ways. And so I don't know that I'm going to watch the worst of them, the goriest of them, the most disturbing of them, because I'm just kind of okay to be sheltered from that.
well, I'll
I,
tell you right now, the two you do not want to see are Martyrs and La Casa Muda, because those were the most disturbing ones we've seen so far.
wow. Okay.
But there's a vampire one called Byzantium that is almost an art piece, and
Interesting.
it's interesting to watch. There's nothing that's hugely disturbing, and the vampire stuff in it is like minuscule. It's like the story itself is more important than the vampire
Okay.
stuff. So it's
Sounds
just
interesting. Okay.
all over the
Yeah.
place.
Very
Yeah,
good.
some good stuff. And then, of course, we're ending the season with Todd and the Book of Pure Evil. It's a series.
There we go.
So
I think I've seen. I know that there's one with. Let's see, Dale and somebody
Dale,
fight
Dale and Todd did something like, against evil with
against
Alan
evil.
Tudyk.
Okay, exactly. So
Yeah,
I wonder if it's of that series or like that, if you will.
I
So
think it's
okay,
like that. I haven't watched it yet.
all
It's
right,
very lighthearted. In fact, after some of the disturbing ones, he said, "Well, I jumped ahead and watched some of that because I needed something a
yeah.
little different."
Actually, I'll throw. By the way, again, kind of a shift, but we've now had your. It's wonderful that you're finding folks to podcast with, and that you're really delving into places where they have knowledge that nobody else has, and you're
Right.
capturing that. As you know, we've had a couple of guests on our show. We had Ted Sikora and now Catherine Karasman, and I just wanted to mention, kind of online and live, she had concerns because we covered so much good information, but oftentimes in real time, I make tons of mistakes. I think just last episode I talked about,
Right.
oh yeah, the reason you get that green going to orange effect is because your rods get tired, and it's your cones. It's cones that are color. Cones are color. CC. So like that. But she talked about how she had a couple slips where she said like Statue of Liberty instead of Liberty Bell, and I in email and we've talked with her. I reassured her like, boy, you gave so much good information that people aren't looking to like jump on you for a little slip. Yeah. But now we should also, I think we will, have an errata section on our.
I did. I put it up on her.
Thank you so much, because I so much want our guests to be comfortable, to know that we are they're our friends. We're taking care of them, and that I always think we get to talking about so many different things, and I know that there's got to be all kinds of like poor vocabulary. We missed this, a perfect reference that we skipped past, whatever. But that's part of the joy of doing things live is you're live without a net. You might be able to say later on, hey, I meant this instead of that. And the people that care too much, that are more critical than they are appreciative, like we're not doing this for them. You know what I mean? We're not doing
Yeah.
this to be perfect. We're not doing this to
I,
avoid having someone come after
I
us.
have a great idea for a live podcast that probably would have worked great at Weem, but who knows?
Okay.
That it's the RG challenge, the RG at the RG challenge.
Okay.
That
There we go.
they throw. Here's a topic, discuss it for 5 minutes, and we discuss it, or do an imitation of this actor, or name 5 songs like this, trivia, just whatever little, can you spin in a circle and blah, blah, and say the top 10, just stupid little stuff like that, but
Okay.
in a very geeky challenge way.
Yeah.
For us to just spew off of. I'm like, that sounds like a lot of fun. We probably like really look like goofballs, but man,
It's,
that sounds fun.
I'll tell you, I was in debate in high school, but I occasionally also did extemporaneous speaking when the IE team needed me. And I was always amazed at, is there anything in the world that I couldn't talk about for 5 minutes?
Right.
I know that's an arrogant, ridiculous thing to say, but unless it's remarkably sophisticated, important to get it right type stuff, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm so goofy.
There's a skill to it.
Read. Yeah, you know what I mean? You just start diving in and make connections and make it funny and and boing, 5 minutes is up. It's like, well, that was nothing. Of course I could do it.
So,
Most people could if they wanted to. They just don't think they can. But
and they get nervous.
yeah.
You know, we did not talk about Wizard World and Fan Expo.
That's right. Fan Expo having gobbled up Wizard World.
Yeah.
You know that there's all kinds of changes from COVID because some companies just couldn't weather the storm of if all their income, all their whatever is based on getting these big gatherings together, and then that dries up for a year and a half, and they didn't build reserves, and they just couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. Whatever they did virtually was nowhere near the revenue generator that it was going to be. So they became vulnerable, and a big company called Fan Expo has gobbled up Wizard World. And I think that I already have like 8 shows scheduled in various different places, including here in Cleveland. So I'm curious. I'd like to see how they handle things. I know that by reputation, I don't know, Wizard World is already not mostly about comic books. It has the whole array of geek culture, if you will. But the more that they get into, to me, celebrity signings and rarefied, well, I paid to get in, and now I still don't have anything that I can go do except the show floor because everything costs. It's off-putting to me. I want to meet my heroes, but I don't want to pay $30 to just shake his hand for 2 seconds or to, anyway. My personal silly concern was I've spoken at Wizard World a couple times, and now that that's changing, I'm hoping that I can say, well, I used to work with Bill, and hey, Tom, you're the new guy, but you can go look in the old program. I'll even fax you a copy.
Right.
Said being, oh my God, you're that old school. Hey, I'll send you as an attachment a scan of a copy that proves I did it, and maybe that same string can continue, that when they come in, I think they're looking for speakers, and it doesn't all have to be interviewing the animator of Archer. It really can be a guy that knows a little bit about comic books, a guy that knows a little bit of horror movies, that kind of stuff. So, and I don't know, then I if I remember correctly, the last time it was, I got some little payment and I got my attendance comp. And
that's
cool. You know what I mean? If I get to go to the show for free, that's worth an hour talk on my part and whatever profit I put into it. So,
and it builds other things. All right. Before we go, I got the word of the week.
Yes.
And you may know this one. I am not sure. I didn't know it. Capitonym.
Oh, it's right. I think it's where the depending on whether you capitalize a word or not, it changes sound or it changes meaning for sure. So like to march along versus march the month. Right. Things like, is that okay?
That's it. Yeah. I had not heard that one before. That was a new one to me. Some of the other was Polish and Polish.
Right. Exactly.
I was like, oh, in China.
Exactly. Especially like where it's both, that it actually changes pronunciation as well as meaning. That's kind of a cool double. Exactly.
They have August and August, but I said, oh, that's probably August and August.
There you go. Exactly.
Hamlet, Mark and Mark. So I was like, oh, there's our word of the week. I didn't know it. I'm sure others don't know it. I didn't discover it. I saw somebody else posted, but I figured I'd share.
It's kind of funny. I love that there are new things being developed like that. I just had a discussion, something popped up in my feed about having had a discussion 3 years ago about the difference between a bacronym and a retronym. And by that meaning, there are some things where it takes on a new meaning different than its old meaning because the old thing is now distinct. And there's others where you have an existing word and you create the acronym that matches it because you want that word to have significance. And so you make it that it, each of the letters has a word behind it. And of course, fleeing from my mind are examples of that. But it was, no, it's that the thing already exists, but it's like, I don't know, when you start saying pencil, but now you have to differentiate between lead pencil and mechanical pencil because mechanical pencils came to be. You know what I mean? So that kind of thing of there's a differentiator. I know that we had any number of systems I designed to wrap the discussion like we always do when I was working for Ameritech, that we were like, what would be a good connotation word for this? How about STEP, the Shared Tables Environment Platform? And it's like, well, it's a little contrived, but the fact that that was already like we made the thing match the word we wanted it to be.
Right.
Instead of it being, it's hard to pronounce, it doesn't have a meaning. We actually had a system called ASIS, which was like the automatic computer information system or something like that. They developed a whole other system of things that had been left out of ASIS, and so I suggested calling it BOA, Bastard of ASIS. They didn't go for that, but I thought it was the truest thing you could have come up with.
Right. Yeah, that's great.
Oh, well.
Yeah. All right, so there's our word of the week. We're more intelligent.
That's a good word. That's a great word. Exactly.
I like that one. So, okay, good one. And we still have some stuff to go on to a little bit more next week.
Exactly. As you know, we always throw out half a dozen topics and we get to like 2 or 3, but it's because some are current and because we get to talking and it's still...
And we try and keep it mixed up so it's not always the same thing. Oh, but come up with whatever you want the next top 10 list to be, or the next 10 list, however.
I will work on that. Oh, in fact, let's see. I wanted to talk about Sin City. What we should talk about is maybe like what's a body of work that's not individual issues, but is there an ongoing series that it's really worth seeking out all of them, because the body of work is even better than any of the individual issues. Right. And I think that Sin City might qualify for one of those. Probably. That read in its entirety, it's like, man, did he do a great job. Cerebus, by Dave Sim it's monumental. So how about that? Bodies of work as opposed to individual issues.
Well, that's good. It takes a little bit of thinking.
It'll take some thought, but we'll work on it. Okay.
Okay, cool.
Thanks very much. Take care, Stephen.
Later, man.
You have been listening to the Relentless Geekery Podcast. Come back next week and join Alan and Stephen's conversation on geek topics of the week.